Sir Henry Cooper was one of the most popular British fighters of all time and was blessed with one of the most devastating left hooks in boxing history. And it was this punch that came so close to changing the course of boxing history forever when he landed it on a young Muhammad Ali's chin. Had that punch have landed earlier in the round, or if Angelo Dundee hadn't noticed the tear on Ali's gloves, then who knows what could have happened. But Ali would recover and stop Cooper on cuts. Although he's most well known for his 2 fights against Muhammad Ali, Cooper actually has a stacked resume against some of the greatest heavyweights of the time. He would face off against earlier heavyweight champions in Ingemar Johansson and Floyd Patterson, losing to both, as well as taking on future Ali opponent Joe Bugner. But Cooper would really flourish at the British, Commonwealth and European level, which considering there was only one champion in the weight divisions at that time is pretty impressive. He would defeat the likes of Brian London, Carl Mildenberger, Zora Foley, Jack Bodell and many others. He was undefeated in British and Commonwealth title fights over a period of 12 years and was European champion for a 4-year stint. He's the only boxer to win a Lonsdale belt outright 3 times and was awarded a knighthood. His record was 40-14-1 with 25 knockouts. Amir Khan is one of Britain's most entertaining fighters of all time. Always willing to go out on his shield and blessed with some of the fastest hands ever seen, Khan was very rarely in a boring fight. And I feel as though his impact on the sport, especially in Britain, and his accomplishments have been underrated in recent years. Khan burst onto the scene at 17 years old, winning the Olympic silver medal, and was instantly a household name. As his career's developed, he has shown signs of vulnerability, but only at the very top level. He's a 2-time world champion who won his first world title in an excellent display against Andreas Kotelnik, and across his career has scored some excellent wins. His gutsy performance against Marcus Maidana is one for the ages, and his performance against the dangerous Devon Alexander was excellent. Khan also scored good wins against Luis Collazo, Zab Judah, Paulie Malignaggi, as well as defeating an albeit slightly older Marco Antonio Barrera, as well as a victory over Chris Algieri. All in all, his resume is fantastic, and he steps in with most of the great fighters of his time, including the likes of Terence Crawford, Canelo Alvarez, Lamont Peterson, Danny Garcia and Kell Brook. He retired with a record of 34 wins to 6 defeats and 21 knockouts. John Conteh was a character outside of the ring and a great fighter inside of it. An excellent technician, blessed with potentially the greatest jab ever seen in the light heavyweight division, Conteh was the light heavyweight champion of the world across a 4-year period. He had an excellent ability to judge distance and was defensively sound. He could throw every shot in the book and was spiteful to go with it. He won the title against Jorge Victor Ahumada and would step in against Hall of Famers such as Alvaro Lopez and most notably, one of the greatest light heavyweights of his time, Matthew Saad Muhammad. Conteh would eventually retire with an excellent record of 34 wins to 4 defeats and 1 draw with 24 knockouts. He was awarded an MBE for his services to boxing and will go down as one of Britain's greatest light heavyweights. Lloyd Honeyghan is one of Britain's most underrated fighters in my opinion. A 2-time welterweight champion of the world who defeated the pound-for-pound star Don Curry in one of the sport's biggest ever upsets. Curry was a superstar when he stepped into the ring with Honeyghan, and Lloyd was given very little chance, but he took the fight to Curry and stopped him in 6 rounds. He would defend the title successfully on numerous occasions before losing it due to a head clash, but would instantly win it back, winning via a knockout with a body shot. Honeyghan was very heavy-handed and worked well up close, a real handful for even the best fighters in the world. Across his career, he would also step in with top fighters such as Vinny Pazienza, Marlon Starling and Mark Breland. He retired with a record of 43-5 with 30 knockouts, and his performance against Curry is still one of the greatest by a British boxer. Throughout the 1980s, Barry McGuigan was one of the most popular names in boxing. An explosive featherweight who constantly backed his opponents up with head movement and aggressive footwork and would unload devastating hooks to body and head up close. McGuigan was extremely strong and heavy-handed. Across an excellent career, he would win the British, European and WBA and Ring Magazine featherweight championships. He would defeat some very good featherweights across the 1980s, including Juan Laporte, Danilo Cabrera and Bernard Taylor. But his greatest victory would come when he defeated the longest reigning featherweight champion of all time, the legendary Eusebio Pedrosa. Going into the fight with McGuigan, Pedrosa had made 19 successful defences of the title. Barry would drop him heavily in the 7th and go on to win on points. He would eventually lose the title to Steve Cruz in a tough fight in the desert heat of Las Vegas. He retired with a record of 32-3 and 28 knockouts. Ricky Hatton is one of the most exciting boxers in recent times and is a true British boxing legend. I don't think I've ever seen a fighter throw such consistently spiteful body shots as Hatton. Hatton was a tremendous inside fighter with extremely underrated skills, especially with his footwork and his ability to create openings. He is also one of the best body punchers Britain's ever produced and had excellent success in the light welterweight division. He'd also move up to welterweight and become a 2-weight division world champion. Hatton steps in with the greatest fighters of his generation and some of the greatest of all time, losing only to the 2 best in Pacquiao and Mayweather. He'd also make a comeback, losing to Vyacheslav Senchenko. But in his prime, he was such a handful for the top fighters in the world. His victory over the dominant Conteh is one of the greatest British performances ever seen. Hatton would also head over to the States and defeat top fighters such as Luis Calzaghe, Jose Luis Castillo and Paulie Malignaggi amongst many others. Hatton's fights were always packed with excitement, and because of this and his likeable personality, he was able to gain one of the most intense fan bases ever seen that would fill out stadiums and travel the world to support the hitman. Prince Naseem Hamed was one of a kind, with one of the most unpredictable and unorthodox styles ever seen, along with some of the most explosive power ever seen from a Brit, unbelievable footwork and head movement. Hamed was a natural entertainer and showman both in and out of the ring. Hamed would go on an extremely impressive run at featherweight, winning 16 consecutive world title fights. During that time, defeating top fighters such as Steve Robinson, Kevin Kelly in an absolute classic, Wayne McCulloch, Paul Ingle and many others. Hamed had excellent timing and reflexes. His shots would come from bizarre angles and were loaded with extreme power. This would mean that his opponents usually wouldn't see these shots coming and would be seriously hurt and knocked out. The majority of his title fight wins would end by knockout. His eventual downfall drastically came when he lost intensity and focus in training and was matched with the all-time great Marco Antonio Barrera. Hamed was never the same after his loss to Barrera, but it's always worth remembering just how good and entertaining this man was in his prime. He would eventually retire with a professional record of 36 wins to 1 defeat and 31 knockouts, having been a featherweight champion of the world for 5 years. Tyson Fury has already cemented himself as a great heavyweight world champion, dethroning the dominant Vladimir Klitschko and twice beating the most dangerous puncher of his era in Deontay Wilder. Fury has provided the public with dominant performances, all-time classic fights and memorable comebacks. Stylistically, there's never been a boxer in history like Tyson Fury. He's ambidextrous, meaning he can box from both southpaw and orthodox comfortably. Is skillful on the back foot, but also aggressive and dangerous on the front foot. Extremely elusive and as tough as they come. His powers of recovery have already proved to have been legendary, especially when he was knocked down in the last round by Deontay Wilder. But on top of all of these stylistic traits, he's 6'9", which makes him so difficult to deal with. He's extremely adaptable and unpredictable. His opponents can never plan for him, as he can always come up with something else. It's worth noting that Fury was actually an underdog going in against Vladimir Klitschko, as Vladimir had been in incredible form and dominated for near a decade. So far in his career, he's won 5 out of 6 world title fights, defeating top names such as Deontay Wilder, Vladimir Klitschko and Dillian Whyte. He has an undefeated record of 33 wins to 1 draw and 24 knockouts, and has held every version of the heavyweight title. Nigel Benn was one of the most aggressive fighters ever. Every time he stepped into the ring, he unleashed a fury that has been matched by few. He was extremely heavy-handed and fought with a relentless intensity. Benn was a 2-weight division champion from middleweight to super middleweight and scored some of the most memorable knockouts from a British fighter overseas. He absolutely blasted away one of the great middleweights of his time in Iron Barkley, a man who had destroyed Tommy Hearns twice and gone the distance with Roberto Duran. Benn came out swinging and stopped Barkley in the first round. He'd also beat good fighters such as Doug Dewitt, Nicky Piper and Robbie Sims, but his greatest victory was against Gerald McClellan. He showed incredible heart in that fight, having been knocked out of the ring in the first round against boxing's most dangerous puncher. He was always most dangerous when he was hurt, and he fought back to secure a late stoppage, in a fight that would unfortunately end tragically for McClellan. His most memorable fights in the UK are by far his 2 against Chris Eubank. Their rivalry, in my opinion, is still the greatest British rivalry of all time, and their fights were packed with ferocious action. Across his career, he'd also face off against the likes of Fulani Malinga, Steve Collins and Michael Watson. He'd retire with a record of 42-5 with 35 knockouts, having been in some of the most exciting fights on British soil. Carl Froch was one of the toughest champions Britain ever produced. An excellent 4-time world champion in the super middleweight division, with an extremely unorthodox yet relentless style that many top fighters struggled with. Froch was extremely entertaining, with underrated skills and one of the best resumes ever compiled by a British fighter. Across a 6-year period at the world level, Froch would fight back-to-back top world champions. After beating the undefeated Jean Pascal in a modern classic to win his first world title, he then took on 2 of the best American super middleweights in the world. Firstly, against Jermaine Taylor, climbing off the canvas to pull off one of the greatest comebacks I've ever seen in the last round, and then outpointing the skillful Andre Dirrell over a close 12 rounds. He'd then lose an all-time classic to Mikhail Kessler, but would go on to beat the likes of Arthur Abraham and Glenn Johnson in a memorable fight. He would lose to the pound-for-pound star Andre Ward, but would then bounce back into an extremely dangerous fight against Lucien Boutte, who was considered the favourite going in. Froch destroyed Boutte in a devastating performance and would go on to beat Mikhail Kessler in another modern classic in their rematch. He would then finish his career off with 2 wins over George Groves in a memorable rivalry, his final punch being one of the greatest he ever threw. Froch retired with a record of 33 wins to 2 defeats and 24 knockouts. He was in multiple Fight of the Years, and in his last 12 fights, 11 of those were consecutive top world champions. Chris Eubank is a British boxing icon who took part in over 20 world title fights, beating some of the greatest fighters of his time in some of the most exciting fights of the era. A true showman who mesmerised fans both in and out of the ring, but also possessed with an incredible fighting IQ, excellent skills and knockout power. But what made Eubank so great was his durability and his mental toughness. His chin was extraordinary and he was always able to dig deep and get through tough times against some of the hardest punchers of his era. Eubank was a two-weight world champion, undefeated across a consecutive 19 world title fights at super middleweight and middleweight. He would score a win and a draw against his bitter rival Nigel Benn in what I consider to be the greatest British boxing rivalry ever, as well as beating top names such as Michael Watson twice, Gary Stretch and many others. He fought Steve Collins twice and gave Joe Calzaghe one of his toughest ever fights. He retired with a record of 45-5-2 with 23 knockouts. Ken Buchanan is one of the greatest British boxers that never gets talked about enough nowadays. Widely considered as the greatest Scottish boxer of all time, Buchanan was a lightweight champion of the world in the 1970s. Buchanan would travel to Puerto Rico to take on the legendary Panamanian Hall of Famer Ishmael Laguna to win the title. He would successfully defend the title multiple times, as well as beating Laguna again in a rematch. He would ultimately face off against his toughest opponent in the following year in the form of a prime Roberto Duran. Buchanan would give Duran a competitive fight until it was controversially stopped in the 13th round after a low blow. Many years later, Duran would still claim that Buchanan was his toughest opponent. Buchanan would also defeat Hall of Famer Carlos Ortiz, as well as Scottish icon Jim Watt, amongst many others. He was blessed with one of the greatest jabs ever seen in the lightweight division, was an excellent mover, and had all-round solid boxing skills. In his prime, his record was 56 wins to 2 defeats. But he would finish his career with a record of 61-8 and 27 knockouts. Joe Calzaghe was a phenomenal fighter. Boxing out of the southpaw stance, he was able to throw a seemingly unlimited amount of punches over 12 rounds due to his excellent gas tank. He was at his very best at super middleweight, where he dominated for nearly a decade, making 20 world title defences, which is still a division record to this day. Many of Joe's fights were entertaining because he never took a backward step. He could overcome adversity, as well as comfortably put on a boxing clinic against some of the most dangerous fighters in the world. Across 46 fights, with half of them being world title fights, he won every single one. His greatest victory, in my opinion, is his victory over Mikhail Kessler, who was undefeated, primed and extremely dangerous. Calzaghe would beat a handful of great fighters of his era, most notably Roy Jones Jr., who albeit was slightly past his best, but was dominated by Calzaghe. Calzaghe would also score a great victory over Bernard Hopkins, which with hindsight is even better, considering all the success Hopkins had in his late 40s. His demolition of Jeff Lacey, going into that fight as an underdog, is probably the greatest British masterclass ever seen on these shores. And on top of that, he has excellent wins over the likes of Chris Eubank, Peter Manfredo and Robin Reed. He's one of the few world champions with over 40 fights to retire undefeated. And in number 1 spot, in my opinion, is Lennox Lewis. Lewis has a resume that's just unmatched by any of the fighters in Britain over the last 60 years. In fact, there's very few heavyweight champions in history that have a resume quite as stacked as Lewis's. Across his career, he would beat the likes of Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, Vitaly Klitschko, Frank Bruno, David Tua, Tommy Morrison, Ray Mercer, Hasim Rahman, Oliver McCall, Razor Ruddock and many others. He would avenge the 2 defeats he had in his career and defeat every opponent he ever faced. He was tough, blessed with excellent boxing ability and a great ring IQ, able to outbox dangerous punchers, but also had lights out power and was capable of knocking anyone out. He would eventually retire with an excellent record of 41 wins, 2 defeats, 1 draw and 32 big knockouts.